So who are you and what do you do?
Okay, my name is Bob Tapscott. I've had a long career in technology, and I've had a very eclectic set of jobs, actually. I went from, water ski instructor to fighting forest fires to being a nuclear medicine technician. Then I got myself into the computer industry and ended up in Brussels with a team of about 6 people developing what became the international banking system for Citicorp. From there, I became the chief information officer of a variety of banks. Worked for JP Morgan on Wall Street and complex derivatives for a while, and bizarrely found myself as the chief designer and architect for the system that supplies the directions to take off and land the world's aircraft, both for Boeing and for Airbus. And so basically, I've done many different things in my life. I also worked at a nuclear reactor for a period of time. So I've had a very varied background, touching on many different technologies and many different businesses.
Now, the last name might sound familiar to some because I've had people like Don Tapscott on the show. I've had Alex Tapscott on the show. I've had both of them together on the show.
Oh,
And
wow.
I feel like you're technology rabbits. You just keep spurting up with new Tapscotts, and now you're here.
I'm the most techie of the Tapscotts. Let's put it that way.
Which
Okay.
is saying a lot.
Well, yeah, Don and Alex talk about technology. I talk about it far less, and I've done much more in terms of actually designing, building, and implementing it. So
You're
I'm the
talking.
nerd. I'm the nerd in the family.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's amazing that there's more nerdy, and they just keep becoming more and more nerdy as I meet the extended family. But you're talking a lot about it these days. You have a new book out called Trivergence, and again, I keep joking with Alex that it seems like he's going into the family business. It seems like now you're going into that side of the family business
I
too of bookmaking.
I guess I am. Saw some interesting technologies emerging, and I felt that given my background, I might have some skills in terms of articulating what they are, how they work, and what the potential impact would be on society.
That's great, and it's a wonderful book, and it's perfect timing for it.
Well, thank
Let's
you.
let's start off with one of the main ideas that you're bringing forward, which is this idea of this is the second era. It's interesting to hear someone talk about it as a secondary era because most of us consider Web 3 this sort of read web, this read write web, and then now this read own web, or however else we're defining the third web. Do you see what made you think it was two and not lay into the three theme that most technologies seem to be doing?
I mean, there are many different frameworks that one can employ. Is that to some people, this is the fourth industrial revolution.
Yeah.
In the context of computers, is that the first era we spent a great deal of time articulating to programming computers in terms of telling them what to do. Okay, I think in some ways this is the second era in which, as opposed to telling them what to do, we're going to be asking them what to do and how to do it. So it's a complete new paradigm in terms of how we think about computing.
And is that what you mean is the defining line between the first era and this era, where this era is about it telling us versus input? It's now its output would be the equivalent of what our input used to be. Is that what we're looking at?
Well, yeah, I mean, before we, in effect, told them what to say back to us. And I think we're into a new era where what they say back to us will be highly educational. It'll be entertaining, and it will be transformational.
Yeah.
Some of the things it'll say back to us will be very true. Some of the things it will do to us can be hugely beneficial, and some of the things it can do to us can be highly detrimental. We're into a fascinating new era that is going to transform society as we know it.
I always tell people that I've been interested in a part of the computational technological revolution since the early 80s when I switched from an Atari 2600 to an Atari 800 computer.
Oh, wow. What a transformation.
It was huge. Yeah, tons of functionality, Bob, as I'm sure you remember. But I'd be curious for you, like what got you interested in computers and actually making them do things versus just as I was doing, which was playing with them and admiring them and using them from a more utilitarian standpoint.
Gee, this was a long time ago, but I was hired to do statistics for a nuclear medicine department. And their equipment was producing absolutely terrible images. They were just awful. And the trained professionals, what they would do is they'd follow the procedures more religiously. And it was a fairly complicated looking beast. And I realized in terms of the dials and knobs on the thing that we were touching 3 of the 16 dials on the machine. So I took back to my room in residence the technical manual for the thing and figured out what the heck the rest of the dials did. And it was a fairly complicated, in effect, computer system. And so when I went back after doing the normal scan, I'd experiment with the dials, and I eventually went into the doctors and gave them a high resolution, high contrast scan, which is something they'd never seen before. So I got some very positive feedback early on in terms of my experience with computing, and in no time I was helping other students learn computer science in university. And after university, I don't know why I do know why, but my logic was poor. I ended up working in the Arctic in a mine in the winter. And when I came back with a degree in mathematics, it's the logical place seemed to be to get into the computer industry. And, I'm fairly old. That was before it was cool. In fact, as crazy as this may sound, my first computer job was for a corner store with 500 different locations. And I found that when talking to strangers, it was better for me to say I worked in a corner store than I worked in the back office in the computer department of the corner store. Now that times have changed, but there was once upon a time that if you were in the computer business, you were looked upon as being dysfunctional and odd.
No, it was no fun being in high school with my passions and interests. I mean, from Dungeons and Dragons to computers, I was not a well-liked individual. So I'm with you there, Bob.
Oh,
I'm with you.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can relate to that, can you? And
Yeah.
suddenly when people saw a lot of money in the business,
Yeah.
suddenly it became cool. Right.
That's true. Even back then, I remember in the early iterations of CPUs and building your own home computers, that you had to, even if you had someone who had built it for you, you had to do a bit of the work. I'm reminded even later on of when modems first came in, there were internal and external modems.
Yes,
And there was
indeed.
this quasi thing of, well, if you can handle how to cool the modem internally and manage it yourself, you don't need to have it in the fancy plastic box as an external mode. It's crazy
No,
times.
a long time ago, but I do remember changing the dials on a large mainframe computer and reading the lights, and actually through the dials modifying the machine code in such a way that it would branch differently. So yeah, I mean, back then being a techie nerd had a very different meaning.
I also would like to move forward into the present, which it sounds like we're talking about the Stone Age. It wasn't the Stone Age, it was several decades ago, which also makes me reflect on the timeline of history and how where we could be just a sort of meaningless life in the grand scale of time. It's pretty amazing the evolutions we've made with computational powers to sit where we are today in 2024 at, I think, some type of precipice, and especially in relation to artificial intelligence and how it's going to impact society. Do you reflect on that? However long it's been in these storied careers, it's still pretty quick, and we're moving pretty quick. I jokingly say when I give keynotes that if we talk about how things are changing quickly, isn't it boring already? We've been saying that since the late 70s and early 80s.
True, but this time is different, very different. If I can give you A simple example of the Trivergence is that Moore's law said that the density of circuits, computers, double about every 2 years.
Right.
And if you take that over 10 years, it means the power of computers would go up about 1,000 times per decade. And that was staggering, right? I mean, that's very, very impressive. But as a result of the blockchain, okay, another of the corners of the Trivergence is that a new architecture for computing became dominant. As it turns out, mining for crypto is best done not by a large, complex, and smart CPU, such as the Intel A9. To get the right answer, the guesses are best done by thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of very simple computers. And simple means smaller, which means, given the speed of electricity, faster if you have tens of thousands of very simple, very inexpensive chips. Processing it for mining blockchain, you got 1,000 times increase in terms of throughput and performance. So when you couple that with Moore's law, what it means is what we witnessed is for performing things such as graphics cards or mining for Bitcoin or AI. In the last 10 years, we haven't seen a 1,000-fold increase in throughput. We've seen 1,000,000 times increase in throughput. Then in effect, Moore's law is dead, is that for tasks such as AI that require a great deal of, or allow a great deal of parallelism, that through massive parallel computing, is that Moore's law is now dead, is that in the next 10 years, computers are going to go up another 1,000,000 times in terms of processing power. So the staggering increases we've seen in the past are soon about to be dwarfed.
Can you put a date stamp on the death? When did that happen? Because again, it seems to be this trope you still hear from time to time. When did Moore's law become a thing of yesterday? What year would it have been?
Well, it's funny. I remember telling the CEO of a bank in the 1990s that it was about to happen, and I was hopelessly wrong at that. But I'd say it began with blockchain, so that's about 11 or 12 years ago. I think it became evident to many 5 years later, and I expect it's evident to most, with the exception of those at Intel, that it's happening today.
And I'm also curious about some of the things we hear in the media. More recently, we heard things like Meta has introduced a chip that's 3 times faster than anything they've had. We obviously see what's been happening with NVIDIA, both its performance in the stock market, but also the dire supply need of all of this chip and compute power for what we're trying to do with AI. Do you look at that? Where do you think we're at with that? How are we doing? Is it a problem for us? Do we have unlimited compute? It seems to be a big thing, this problem of compute.
Well, two things. About 10 years ago, Intel and NVIDIA were in about the same ballpark in terms of pricing. Today, NVIDIA is worth 10 times what Intel is worth. And of the blockchain, Bitcoin, whatever gold rush, it turns out that NVIDIA was the company that sold the shovels. And many people have talked about gold rushes. So that was a hit or miss if you actually tried to find the gold, but you were a definite winner if you sold shovels. So it's happening, and it's happening far faster than people expected. So the demand for NVIDIA chips seems truly explosive. Now, in the context of Meta and Apple and others saying that they've designed, smarter chip complexes than NVIDIA, much easier said than done. The irony of it all is that the Intel i9 chip is incredibly complicated. It does more than add, subtract, multiply, and divide. It does geometric functions and a whole bunch of other things. It's called a complex instruction set computer. While what NVIDIA produces is just a massive array of really, really simple chips. So Meta and others say, hey, producing simple chips is easy, particularly when the company that produces the most dense chips is available to anyone who can send them a design, which is TSMC in Taiwan. So it's very easy for many companies to say, hey, I'm a software company, but I'm going to jump into the chip business. I think they're going to find it a bit harder than they envision.
So what happens? What happens in a world where we have one or two who are really the ones holding the keys to how quickly we can drive this thing?
Well, if you look back at the history of technology, or let's just take the PC as an example, is in the beginning, WordPerfect was better than Word, and Lotus was definitely better than Excel, particularly the early versions of Excel. But what do you know is that within a department, people standardize, and within a company, people standardize. And before you know what happened, industries had, and the world had, is that in terms of technology for interoperability and compatibility, is that we tend to converge on single technologies. Is that, there's Google, and according to Google, the number one search on Bing is to get to Google. Is sure, there's Wayfair, but Amazon has the vast majority of that industry. So technology tends to converge to one particular vendor. Now, the thing about artificial intelligence is that it is not as smart as the programmer's program. It is intelligent as the mountains of data you have. And he or she who has the most data likely will end up with the most intelligent system. So the consolidation in AI could be much faster than in terms of history, because it won't be a question of what people prefer. It'll be a question of the company that has the most data, has the smartest system, will get more customers, ending up in more data, and so on, until there are very few players in the industry.
That's
Now,
interesting, though, because what you're saying is, whereas I was focused on the silicone and the chips and where we're going to go with the speed of this technology and who has access to it, you're almost parlaying that into this idea that really what we're talking about is low or high quality data. That's going to be the real impact here, not necessarily how fast we go, but what we're putting into it. So the fuel, not the engine.
yes, exactly. Well articulated. So Alex, my nephew, Don's son, has written a book that says how through blockchain technology, we could end up in a very different world where AI is based on distributed databases, where people own their own data, and it's not the property of Google or Facebook or whomever. Now, that's a beautiful vision. It's technically very difficult to achieve, Web3. And of course, I think we can expect is that the empire will fight back if it gains any ground or headway. So, we live in very interesting times. Web3 makes a great deal of sense in terms of the potential advantages to us as individuals. But whether or not it'll ever fly, that's a much more difficult question.
Tell me why, for Trivergence, you went down the path of artificial intelligence, blockchain, and Internet of Things. Was it that you could provide catch-alls for all this technology and software to fall in one of those three areas? Is it because we're seeing a moment in time where, regardless of adoption of all these technologies, I do think it is true that this is a stranger moment because we have these foundational ones, the three that you mentioned, Trivergence, all coming to some type of fruition, or maturation at a very unique time. What was your thinking around that? How far off base am I?
You're not. It's just that the synergies between the three are just so clear, is that AI would not be where it is today if it wasn't for the million-fold increase in computer power that was driven by the blockchain, and it would be nowhere where it is today if it wasn't for the massive amounts of data that are coming off of IoT devices that are in people's bodies, are in medical labs, and in other ways have created data that AI can look at to come up with, revolutions in terms of potentially managing, controlling, and eliminating disease. So for it all to happen was, AI got a lot smarter thanks to the efforts of three different professors. And it got a lot faster thanks to Bitcoin miners. And it got smarter based on the amount of data that from the IoT it's able to perceive. Is that right now, for instance, ChatGPT and the New York Times are in a lawsuit, not surprisingly, because ChatGPT scanned and read every version of the New York Times. And I have no doubt that ChatGPT will have soon read my book and be drawing insights from it as well.
For those who don't know, Bob, tell me about these three professors.
Okay, their names are Jeff Hinton from the University of Toronto, Yashua Benjo from the University of Montreal, and Jan Lucan, who's at a university in New York City. And basically what they came up with is that there's a picture in the book, but what a neural network looks, it looks like a massive, it's got a whole bunch of dots and not a whole bunch. In terms of ChatGPT, it's rumored that the current version has over 200 trillion nodes, and it has lines of logic connecting all of these nodes. And so what these three came up with is a revolution in terms of how AI software works. Is that I gave it a shot in the 1980s and got nowhere. I gave it a shot in the 1990s and got nowhere. But what these three came up with and published were papers on how not to just move forward through the neural network, but to move back. Back propagation is the term they use, in such a way that it learns from its own experience in terms of refining how it thinks. And if it wasn't for the revolution in software, AI would not be where it is today. So, as an example, Jeff Hinton was at the University of Toronto, and as soon as he demonstrated his technique, surprise, surprise, he was spending 25% of his time at Google. And not surprisingly, he's recently said that in some ways he may regret what he has created. Whether it turns out to be a monster or an angel is yet to be proven, but he has articulated grave concerns.
I think it was his paper also that was the technological basis for OpenAI and ChatGPT. I think it was it switches or what am I thinking
Well,
about here?
neural networks go back to, I think it was the 1940s. If I remember correctly, let me just think for a second, that Walter Pitts and Warren McCulloch came up with the idea of, surprise, surprise, getting a computer to work the same way the human brain does based on the concept of neural networks. So the concept is very, very old. It's just the Trivergence that means that suddenly its capabilities have exploded. I'd say exponentially, but it's on exponents on exponents on exponents in such a way that it's going to have a rapid and profound transformation on the way we work, think, and play.
I talk about, in particular, generative AI and what it's doing, but I think a lot about artificial intelligence as well. And I think a lot of the ruminating you did in Trivergence is similar to my thinking as well, which is that
Go on.
ultimately there are going to be some really difficult decisions that will have to be made in both society and in business for sure. Can you walk me a bit down that? Because what I feel we hear is a lot of the rhetoric typically right now, which is you have very smart people on one side saying, we're all doomed, kiss your kids goodbye already. It's that disastrous. And you have others saying, like Douglas Rushkoff comes to mind, where he'll say something like it's, a very interesting web interface, but not even as smart as Wikipedia on a bad day would be his relationship to a chat GPT. What do you see as the main difficulty in terms of what we're not seeing as a society? What are we not talking about here?
Well, the thing about AI is that, in effect, it's a psychopath, and that is that it has no idea what it's telling them. It's read everything on the internet, and apparently not all of it is true. And so sometimes AI will, ChatGPT will
Hallucinate
tell you the
or
truth.
yeah.
Sometimes it'll lie through its teeth. Sometimes it'll hallucinate. Sometimes it'll hallucinate in very creative and wonderful ways. But it has no idea of what it's doing and the impact of what it's doing, and whether or not what it's saying is true or it isn't true. Is that when you look at the impact in society, there is no doubt that you know office workers. It will soon be on all of their desks, and in 5 to 10 years, it'll soon be in all of their chairs. Is that even for radiologists that have studied for 10 or 12 years, is for the simple ability that it can analyze, 100,000 previous MRIs and the results of those MRIs. It's as good at doing a radiologist's job as 97% of people in the profession. So, and of course, it's improving. I mean, I talked about this somewhat comically in terms of in the last chapter, and that having been a math major, I had a rule when my kids were young or were young teenagers. And that is, if I was in a meeting, if I was working in my study, I could not be disturbed under any circumstance unless it was math homework. And if it was math homework, okay, they could come in and I would shut down the meeting. I would stop what I was doing. There was nothing more enjoyable in life than math homework. And not only was that the rule for my kids, that was the rule for all of the kids in the neighborhood, is that nothing was more fun than math homework. After 10 years of trying, is that, what do you know, one turned out to be a geologist and the other one is now a public school teacher. The point being is that from one generation of human to the next generation of human, to teach them what we know is a difficult, time-consuming, and far from perfect process. But for one generation of computer that's 1,000,000 times faster than the previous generation of computer, is that the process is instantaneous. So they have a certain advantage in terms of thinking that we don't and never will. Some have, as a joke, have said, of course it's going to eventually get so much smarter than us, it'll look upon us as ants and kill us. It's just the next phase of evolution. Now, depending on your sense of humor, that may be funny. I don't think it's particularly funny, but some people are making that case. But I think we've got to channel and harness that in such a way that it has benefits for all.
But there's an interesting thing to think about here, which is if we look back historically of the innovative changes we've seen through technology, whether it's the steam engine, electricity, etc., there was some tools that were there to definitely extend the day and give us power and things like that. But it feels like anything related to automation, they came for our hands and we were like, oh, that's okay. But now that this might be coming for our brains, we're like hands off. It's like a weird thing going on there.
Well articulated. John Maynard Keynes, 100 years ago, predicted that with advances in technology, is that when we ask someone what do, they would define themselves by their hobbies, not by their work. Is that we'd all be working 10 or 15 hours a week, and the rest of the the rest of it would be leisure time. That possibility is still out there. There's no doubt about it. And AI could achieve that, or we could achieve that through AI. But the computer has not reduced the work week. The cell phone has not reduced the work week. Is that working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as one of my daughters, who's in investment banking now does, is just seems to, in some professions, be the norm. And if you want to play that game, a computer can work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year without washroom breaks, without vacations, without sick days, at a far lower cost for many jobs than humans do today. And I think in some ways that has profound societal impacts, and we've got to think about that and think that through. The Industrial Revolution has benefited greatly the vast majority of people living today. But at the beginning, it was literally out of Dickens. And I fear that the implementation of AI on a broad basis could create a much better society, or a Dickens-like society. And that, to a great degree, is why I wrote the book Trivergence, so people would understand what these technologies are, why they're coming on board so quickly, how they interrelate, and a framework in which we could intelligently discuss the potential impact of these technologies.
Is the challenge or concern then that not that we won't get to the Dickens moment, but what happens in between because of the mass job loss, displacement? What what are your thoughts there? Seems to be one of the bigger things that somebody like Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus*, is concerned about. That you have this place, Germany pre-World War II, very, very high unemployment, around 25%, and it's a festering ground for extremism, which give rise to people, like Hitler. Do you not worry about that? Because I tend to be as optimistic as you are that we will get to a moment where we're going to see a better. I'm hopeful we make it to that. But my concern now is that short period of time between now and then that could be very, very traumatic and very, very destructive.
Absolutely. Is that having been the CIO of different banks, and having to have sold every major idea I had to both the CFO and the CEO, I know when I walk in and say, I've got this idea on how we can dramatically reduce costs, they both sit up and pay attention. But if I walk in and say, I've got this idea on how we could create, a different product or service, or how
Digital
we,
economy. Yeah.
right, or how we could make the working environment a more pleasant place, their eyes glaze over. And sure, I've been able to sell many of the broader, less NPV-based business cases, but it's a much more difficult sell. And I think for many corporations, they'll just jump on the potential to reduce costs and reduce staff, and we could end up into a very difficult pickle.
So what do we do? How do we avoid this? Is it simply acknowledging it, seeing what it is? Is it slowing it down? At the beginning of all this, there was this idea of having this great pause on the development of some of these tools. Some people even make the argument with blockchain. The joke is it's a very slow database. That was the joke for all. Even Internet of Things. I see the connection less about whether or not my lights will go on and off, but more about if we can deploy AI and blockchain into any robotic type environment. That's what we're talking about. It's like Tesla robots. We're talking about actually replacing things like doctors or tradespeople. That would be potentially one of the scarier moments in time, because then we go from knowledge workers back into trade, and then ultimately what is left. What are we seeing in this?
Well, I mean, soon we're going to see robots building robots to build houses, robots
Sure.
building robots to build cars. So in terms of the potential of creating far more things, and increasing the standard of living of everybody on the planet, it's within our grasp. It's within our reach. is that in some ways, I think if people have a broader understanding of this, we could end up with a more intelligent political discussion on what frameworks we should put in place in terms of implementing these technologies. And I think all of the politicians are concerned and they want to put a sensible framework in place, but they simply have no clue of what that could possibly be. So I think that was why I felt that writing this book was a challenge I wanted to take in terms of getting people a better and broader understanding of what these things are, why they're going to come at us like a freight train, and how we can intelligently respond in such a way that it benefits society as a whole.
I'm curious, Bob, what was your take when you started seeing what OpenAI was doing? Things like the deployment of generative AI tools, ChatGPT, DAL-E, Midjourney. We're now into the world of Sora and video creation, all text driven. What were your thoughts on these capabilities? Do you feel that they're nascent and quite quaint? Do you think they're mind blowing? I'll be honest that a lot of the people complaining about it, I don't know what planet they're on. I've been in this space for a long time, and I'll say that I'm very impressed with what GPT can produce in some of its derivatives.
Yes, it's smart, and it's going to get much smarter much more quickly. I guess in some ways, having dabbled and played in that arena for so many decades, my reaction was, it's about time, because the potential always was there. It just seemed to be a little beyond our grasp. It was, I mean, that was a joke, is that, intelligent AI is 10 years out and always will be, that fusion reactors are 10 years out or 20 years out, and they always will be. And it seemed to be that way in terms of AI for a very long period of time. But that time is clearly over. It's going to come at us very, very quickly.
So let's walk that idea down the road just a little bit as a thought experiment for you and I.
Okay.
I think part of the challenge, as I think more deeply about this, is when people say things like ChatGPT isn't really that good, it's a great web interface, not even as strong as Wikipedia on a bad day, lines like that. My reaction is often perhaps they're placing too high of a bet on what a brain is, a human brain is. And maybe the human brain is much more simpler than we give it credit for. And these tools and how they grow and how they learn and how they start using all this information that's in there will almost be incomprehensible to us. In fact, it will be humbling to realize how simple maybe our brain actually is. And that's the challenge here. It's this hard thing to wrap our head around. That there may be something that we've created that actually expands a definition of what intelligence is or what a brain is.
Clearly, it will. I mean, if you look back at the steam engine, when people put steam engines on boats, many people laughed and said, "This is ridiculous." Okay. Cell power, wind power is free. Okay.
Right.
It's not polluting. Okay. And by the way, in the right wind conditions, a sailboat can go at 5 times the speed of a steam engine.
Right.
What kind of moron put this monster heavy, hot device in the middle of a ship that slows it down? Stupidest thing people had ever heard
Right.
of. Well, you know what? It improved, and over time, we live in a different world. And clearly, there are people who are the dodo birds of of technology who say, well, so far AI is not that smart, okay, but the rate at which it's increasing its intelligence um, as a function of the factors in I've highlighted in the book is
But Bob, my
happening at a
argument,
breathtaking speed.
my argument would be that I think it looks pretty smart to me. I think I'm a smart guy, and when I use ChatGPT, I think it's pretty smart. I mean, that's my general reaction when I'm using these tools. I am usually smiling, usually thinking to myself in my history of working in particular in marketing communications and journalism, that the result it's giving me is already far superior to if I had hired a junior person to go and do some type of work. Its ability to iterate on an idea where I said, not quite, and here's more what I'm looking for. I mean, I'm looking at this going, this is smarter than several people I've worked with. When I tell it to formulate an email, I was working with people who had MBA degrees who couldn't formulate an email.
Yes, I know. It's I think to discount what it can currently do is very naive. Is it can write poetry. It doesn't write great poetry, but it writes poetry a heck of a lot faster than I can.
And
And
I don't think,
it's
you know, Myron,
improving.
yeah, I'd even push on that. I go, I don't care if it can write poetry. What I care about is if I'm a poet and I'm struggling through a prose or I'm looking for a theme, its ability to help me move a lot quicker and be a lot more creative is extremely profound. I'm in a business with one business partner, and I honestly feel that GPT right now is an excellent third partner for us in terms of when we're stuck on an idea or thinking about something, or what would be a go-to market strategy for this, or what would be a better structure for an email marketing campaign. It's doing some real heavy lifting that is impressive as two people here who have experience in those domains.
I agree completely. It's and I can say two things is that from my background in history and perspective in previous efforts, I can say it's about time. I can also
Right.
say
You're
I'm
too loyal.
shocked it had happened
Right. So,
as
let's
quickly as it did.
can we talk about that? So tell me why shocked. And I say this in I was shocked too. I remember literally when it came out, especially ChatGPT is the, you know, we'll call it the killer app. You know, for the web, whether it was the browser or email, we could probably discuss and debate that it was probably email. But to find this killer app so quickly and to realize the power of it, I too was shocked. And that concept of being shocked interested me. Why? Why was I shocked? I had known that OpenAI, I even remember hearing about Elon Musk being one of the early investors, and I've been
Sure.
following the space.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that shock? Because I still don't know that I can reconcile why I was so shocked, but yet here we both sit going, it was shocking.
Well, I guess in some ways is that I've I've known of. I've been playing with the concepts for for half my life, um, and in theory, okay, given the breakthroughs that occurred in the early part of the 20th century, I knew it was getting a heck of a lot smarter. I knew the chips were getting faster. And I knew in theory is that you could read the entire internet and draw conclusions using neural networks on it. So I knew all the ingredients, but when I tasted,
Food.
the results of the recipe, I was stunned.
That's a great
I was
analogy.
simply stunned. I mean, so to me, it was, it's about time, and oh my God, okay, it's actually happening.
Yeah. I'm
But
also
it's only a
curious.
question of time. No, but I agree with you. I mean, it's clearly only a question of when it's going to be smarter than the vast majority of people. Is that, I mean, 10 years ago, people said, well, it could never compose songs. And now people say, well, it just composes mediocre songs. And people 10 years ago said it could never, paint art. And today it paints mediocre art. But it's pretty clear that in terms of what we considered to be definite human abilities that a machine could never simulate, it's not only improving in such a way that it's going to come up with art forms that no human could ever imagine, and it's going to come up with, um, you know, uh, something that's going to top the charts. It's only a question of when. Now you can debate if it's 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, but the debate is on when. The debate on how and why uh, is over. It's going to happen.
I also see the deep irony in these conversations where people say, well, it's good or it's not very good. And I'm always pushing back on, well, tell me what good music is. Tell me what good art is. Tell me what good, like your version of good and my version of good are probably miles apart. And when I'm doing inputs, in particular for it to create something visual for my podcast or what I'm writing, I usually look at it based off of the inputs I've given it and the prompting and think, I don't know if I'd given this to a human who's got an expertise in this type of time and format and style, if they'd be able to do half as good of the stuff I'm seeing it come out with. So I challenge that because we're so quick to defend when it's the human creation of, oh, we can't say what art is good. The public decides what art is good. I'm like, yeah, they kind of do. And I think here it's producing some very good, not just good stuff. That's just my take on it.
Well, absolutely. Is that an AI engine, okay, can, will, and currently is analyzing, every hit that's hit the hit parade the last 50 years.
For sure.
And what do you know? It's finding out certain things, that sad songs sell better than happy songs, that
Yeah.
there are certain rhythms, certain harmonies, certain, other characteristics that to, be thinking about 100,000 songs simultaneously is something that an AI engine can do that just humans can't.
But
It just isn't possible.
Even the business side is moving ahead so quickly. We are seeing right now that the developers of this, we'll call it big tech for the time being. I don't know how many startup entrepreneurs are going to be able to scale with this type of compute and ability. I think that's
Right.
another interesting conversation to probably have. But I do find it fascinating that they are currently creating these licensing deals. I think they realized that they might have stepped over a line for these initial large language models that they needed, but those licensing deals, whether they're between the Googles, Apples, Metas of the world, are happening to have access to that information. Google's an interesting one because they own YouTube and have all of the access to these databases and informations, but I even think that's almost solving for already. Lawsuits being put out by the New York Times or not, it does seem like people are realizing, well, if we have a real licensing deal, we'll have some much better models here.
Well, yeah, I mean, this goes back to, if I remember correctly, it was Google, is that they went, I don't know, into some library and they scanned, hundreds of
for
thousands.
Google Books. Yeah.
Google Books. And instead of trying to negotiate with the different authors and publishing firms, they said, we'll scan it all, we'll put it online, and we'll sort out the economics of it through lawsuits and negotiation later. And I think in some ways you're going to see something similar with AI.
Yes, I think they're going to cut those deals more in advance. I think they're recognizing now that it might be a fool's gold to do it. And we'll see who turns out being right on the economic side of that. I'm curious also about where we sit. I don't know where you live. Are you in Toronto, Bob? Or
I'm currently sitting in Toronto. Yes, I've lived in many places, but I'm now Toronto based.
Yeah, so I'm based in Montreal. We talked earlier about Hinton, based in Toronto, and Bengio, based here in Montreal.
Yes.
Canada recently put out this $2 billion plus statement about how they want to be leaders in AI. I've talked about it almost ad nauseum in terms of my own work and on radio and things like that, but I'd be curious about your perspective of what I think is the real question here, which is geographic borders and this stuff. I feel like we're just getting it all wrong, that it's going to be a country that leads this versus I just don't see it working if we follow this traditional path, almost like we did with publishing, of having to be region by region, like my Netflix in Canada is different from your Netflix in the US. It seems like AI is going to have proliferation everywhere. Do you think that it can be geographically established? Like, does Canada have is it a Chinese thing?
No,
is it a US thing?
there's no hope or no chance of that occurring. It's an impossibility. That two out of the three professors I named are Canadian, or not Canadian. We're based in Canada.
Based in Canada,
right? And I would love to see Canada take a lead role in terms of doing it. And Canada has taken a lead role in some aspects. It did in terms of smartphones with RIM. It did in terms of telecommunications with Nortel. But the long-term success stories, they are not. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But
what do you think about when you see countries like this talk about things like we need to be a leader in it? I'm at the phase where I get this weird feeling of like, I don't, if you're talking like that, do you understand it type of reaction?
I think Canada can be a world leader in it. Now, there's a difference between being a world intellectual leader and, you know, he or she who benefits economically from most of it, as I think, given the consolidation that'll occur within AI, is that we may end up with trillionaires as opposed to 100 billionaires, which to me is not necessarily a good thing. So, where the money flows has yet to be determined, but intellectually, Canada is clearly ahead of the rest of the world in this discipline. The other irony of this is that much of the internet is based in New Jersey, so that for latency, for quick access, um, for reduced response time for American users. In terms of the thinking process of AI, it takes a massive amount of compute power. In fact, originally for ChatGPT, Microsoft concluded it didn't have the compute power
Yeah.
and had to expand dramatically in the context of doing it. But where you do it is if you want to minimize your costs in terms of these offline massive processes, what do you know? The best place to cool it is towards one of the poles. So I think you may see data centers. I mean, take Quebec, cheap electricity, a cool climate. It's got some big advantages in terms of where you put your AI thinking process.
Mhm. There's also the other paradox, as I'll call it, which is we're going to put all this funding into startups and incubators. And yet we have a bit of a leap already with big tech clearly there. They have the money. There's tons of money being invested into these firms because of just the fact that we had some dry powder because of the pandemic and just the nature of venture capital and private equity. Is this maybe a new time to rethink how we do this? Do you think startups even have a chance, or will they simply grow and the ones that are successful will get acquired by big tech, or big tech will just race ahead so fast that it'll be hard to stop them from either stealing the idea or just acqui-hiring it out?
Well, I mean, for a lot of these startups, their exit strategy is indeed a buyout, right? They don't plan to be the company that takes over the world. And barring Web3, it looks pretty clear that those with the largest cloud complexes, the largest compute complexes, are going to be taking a lead in this area because only they have the compute power necessarily to create a smart AI engine.
Hmm. People aren't thinking about this, though. I mean, they really believe that the next Google or Facebook's going to come out of a garage. And when it comes to things like AI and blockchain, I'm thinking that it's just going to be funded out of Facebook and Google. Like, it's going to be really hard to have these unique players. I guess with NVIDIA, you might see some shift in business modeling, but I don't know how startups play in this realm specifically because of what you just said.
It's difficult. Is that if you focus on a particular area, this is not a small area, but if you focus on building an AI engine to cure cancer, and what do you know? You cure cancer. Obviously, there's a pretty good business case for that effort. So I think in terms of focusing your AI attentions on a specific and complex domain, can certainly pay and pay significant benefits in the next 5 to 10 years. But in the long view, I see that consolidation definitely.
One of the things I've seen lacking in the conversation and literature and just online discourse about all of these things from the growth of blockchain and AI to IoT is that there was a term we were tossing around for a while a couple of years back called big data. And that term kind of disappeared. And I was interested in Trivergence. You talk about infinite data. Talk a little bit about that because I find it curious that we don't use the word big data anymore. Like I just don't hear it anywhere.
Well, I mean, it's big. It got bigger, biggest. Okay, I threw an infinite. Is that the majority of the world's data was created in the last 2 years, and I suspect a year from now, the majority of the world's data will have been created in the last year. So it's going up exponentially. Yes, as a mathematician, I have abused the term infinite. No doubt about it. My math professors, if they were living today, would be most upset with me at the misuse of that term.
It's like when people say exponential, I'm always reminded that it's a mathematical, it's not just a random word to mean a lot. There's actually some theory behind it.
Well, yeah, okay. Exponential has a definite meaning to mathematicians.
Yeah.
Right.
Before we get going, I'm curious about another component, which I think is true. And I brought it up in some of my keynote presentations, and I struggle with illustrating it. This idea that if you take it not that far, in fact, sometimes it's doing it right now already, the systems are programming without us, without humans. And
Correct.
while we can intuitively say, I get that, I think there's something very radical in this idea that something is creating something without like a keyboard and typing keys or using a keyboard to create this output. And then what happens when it gets very sophisticated? How do we as humans edit, curate programming that may have been created in a way in which we would never even be able to input it as a thought?
Well, I've tried to explain that to the best of my ability in the book. Is that back in the day of expert systems, you'd sit down with an expert, okay, be it a lawyer, be it a doctor, whatever, and that you take their logic, and to the best of the ability is that you'd design a system. So when it got the answer to 30 diagnostic questions, it would come to a somewhat rational conclusion. Is he or she, the programmer, wrote the logic in terms of doing it. Now, when you take a look at the logic derived from a trillion nodes, you hear some people in the industry demanding greater transparency. The point of it being is make it as transparent as you want. No human is going to be able to look at those trillion nodes
To parse
and
it.
to parse it. It's being how it thinks is beyond our capabilities of understanding. So yes, that has definite implications. It's going to come to conclusions that we will be shocked by. There's no doubt about it.
And I might not even be able to communicate in this simple typing form that we've been using for several thousand years.
Yeah, I mean, it. There was one example. Help me here. What company was it? I think it was Facebook. Is they had two AI machines talking to each other in English, and after a period of time, it decided that it was going to dispense with English and start talking in its own language,
Yeah.
which people could not understand what it was saying and what it was communicating. So, they pulled the plug. So, yes, we're in for some big surprises. There's no doubt about it.
Especially when it figures out how to not let us pull the plug. That's the one we're worried about.
Well, yeah, if I can give you a simple example of one of the big concerns is that, there are now AI killing machines in Israel and in Ukraine and in other places. And invariably, what's going to happen is, the objective is to win. And although these machines aren't communicating with each other, soon to win a particular battle, if your AI killing machines can communicate with other AI killing machines, obviously it's going to do a much better job in terms of doing it. And the side that allows the computers to make and execute a decision in a thousandth of a second, as opposed to wait for human review, what do you know? There's going to be collateral damage, but the side that empowers the killer computers are most likely to win that particular battle. And of course, the objective is not to win the battle, the objective is to win the war. So clearly, if you have, your 100,000 killing machines communicating quickly with each other without human intervention, your chances of winning the war are far greater. And nobody is going to design a system to lose a war. So before you know what happens, it's quite possible that we have these massive autonomous armies of drones and robots and tanks that unilaterally can make killing decisions on a rapid scale. And you'd say, of course, no one's ever going to do that. But trust me, nobody is ever going to design their systems to lose a battle or to lose a war. So we do live in most interesting times.
You and I should turn that into a script for a movie. And oh, wait, they did. It was called Terminator. It's literally the story of Terminator.
Well,
So,
yeah, that was
so
just
let's hope we don't turn Terminator into nonfiction, is what we're saying. We don't want that.
We would hope not. Okay,
Yeah.
but I think we may be faced with 100,000 Terminators after us as opposed to one. The problem could be a little more complicated.
Well, again, let's hope
than
we're both.
in the movie.
We'll hope we're both wrong about that. Bob, tell me the one thing that made you think differently.
In terms of my life, or in terms of writing the book, or in what context?
I want people to hear people who are smart like you explain that you have previously held beliefs. You read something, you see something, you listen to something, and you realize that you were wrong and it's changed your perspective.
Well, I guess the most profound one of that was that this was a long time ago, but what happened is a airplane was shot down by North Korea. This was a long time ago. And at the time, I happened to be in New York, and I read what Reagan had to say about how this was cold-blooded murder. And then I flew to Germany, and what Das Spiegel had to say was there are three things we know for sure. We know the Americans are lying, we know the Koreans are lying, and we know the Russians are lying. And in some ways, I came to the belief that if we could just have a world where the front page of the New York Times was the New York Times, the second page was the BBC, the third page was Le Monde, translated into English, is that if we could get access to other people's ideas and other people's information, world harmony would result. And to a great degree, the very opposite has occurred.
I was going to say, we have that and it didn't work. Yeah.
It did not work, is that the world is being divided badly by narrowcasting. And if you watch, for example, in the US, MSNBC, and you watch Fox News, they're two different countries. They have very little in common with each other. And the technology that I hoped and aspired could achieve greater peace is having the very opposite effect. And I think in some ways that's one of the biggest disappointments in terms of my many aspirations of what technology could do in terms of benefiting the human race.
Yeah.
I hope I'm not disappointed again.
Yeah, I mean, I would, if I was asked that question, I don't know if I would answer it that way, but hearing you say it, it's exactly how I would have answered it, because that's exactly how I feel as well. I can't thank you enough for your time, Bob. The new book is called Trivergence. Let people know where they can find out more about the book, other stuff you're creating, whatever else is going on with you.
Sure. Trivergence, it's available on Amazon and pretty well every other bookstore. I saw recently it's at the MIT bookstore. Is that if you want to look at my blog or get some of the comments people have made about the book, you can look at tapscottadvisors.com. But if you Google Bob Tapscott and Trivergence, you'll likely end up on the Amazon website in your country.
That's great. Well, Bob, thanks so much for your time.
True pleasure. The oldest podcast out there. I'm impressed.
Well, business and maybe, I'm not sure, but thank you.
Great conversation. Really enjoyed it.